Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So that was the test run. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very special welcome to each and every one of you. Let me also say a very special welcome to those of you joining us online for this important conversation this evening. We're joining you live from the Wolmer's Auditorium in Kingston, Jamaica, and our conversation will be focused on our young people, our youth, and spending on education. Now, there's a thing here in Jamaica where we always say that it takes a village to raise a child. But the reality is it takes more than a village. It takes cash and it takes resources that must be pumped into ensuring that our young people are enriched in the best way. Now, today's report, Room for Improvement, the Gap Between Public Spending and Child Outcomes, is going to delve into assessing whether or not those resources are going where they ought to in a fulsome sense. And you will get the sense, ladies and gentlemen, of just how the financial resources are being allocated, and the conversation will be had today, and you will be involved in this conversation as well. My name is Javon Keys, and the pleasure is mine to be your master of ceremonies for this evening's event. And let me take the opportunity as well to say a very special welcome to Roberto Conseco Martinez, His Excellency, Mexican Ambassador to Jamaica. Bienvenido, señor. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí. Let's also say a very special welcome to Olga Isasa, who is the UNICEF representative here in Jamaica and the UNICEF team overall. And it's very important for me to note that the team at UNICEF, they were the ones who commissioned CAPRI, the leading think tank in the region, to execute this report, because they found it very important to have the conversation about what we are going to be discussing today. And you'll hear a lot more about our findings, of course, later on. Let me also take the opportunity to extend a very special welcome to the CAPRI board members and the executive body, including Stephen Facey, chairman of the CAPRI board. Let me ask you to, I should have done this before, but you can put your hands together for the persons who, as I call their names. So, of course, His Excellency, of course, Olga, of course, the CAPRI team, including Stephen Facey, chairman of the board and chairman of Pan Jam Group, along with Dr. Damian King, executive director of CAPRI. The applause. Let me also say a very special welcome to Dr. Stephen Carr, representing the Ministry of Education, Skills, Youth and Information, and other ministry representatives. Here I see the team from NCEL and other agencies in the room. Let me also say a very special welcome to Mr. Taron Francis, Chief Fiscal Economist and Fiscal Policy Management in the Fiscal Policy Management Department at the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, the nation's purse. Put your hands together for the gentleman, please, along with other representatives from that ministry. Let me also extend a warm welcome to Lauren Marston, Senior Education Specialist at the World Bank, Sharon Hay Webster, Special Projects Coordinator at the Urban Development Corporation, Siretz Bell, CEO of True Foundation, Andrea Edwards-Brown, Senior Director of Cross-Sectoral Coordination at the Early Childhood Commission, and all other specially invited guests. For those of you online as well, we're so happy to have you here. So I started out with the preface that we always speak about our youth in Jamaica. That is always something that is front of mind for us in the conversation. And many people will ask the question, how is the money spent? When you look at the fair share of the national budget, a very large majority of that fund, of those funds, go to education. So, of course, the minds of our Jamaicans and anyone at all in any country, is not unique to us, is how is it being spent and is it trickling down? So we will hear a lot more about that in the conversation today. But before I move into our partner remarks from Dr. Damian King, Executive Director of CAPRI, let me also remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that you get to be a part of the conversation, because this is a report that will help us to realize that education is not just a government or a private sector discussion. It's a whole of society reality, and each of us has a role to play. When you look at our National Development Plan Vision 2030, which aims to make Jamaica the place of choice to live, work, raise families, do business, and retire eventually. The idea is that education is fundamental to that, which is why one of our core goals in Vision 2030 is that Jamaicans are empowered to reaching their fullest potential. And when you think about us implementing Vision 2030 and our sustainable development goals, which are more than 91% aligned, goal 4, which is one of my favorite goals, is quality education. So it is absolutely important for us to have this discussion today. So our Slido, ladies and gentlemen, will allow you to be able to share your questions and comments throughout the discussion, especially when we get to the panel discussion of our program. So I invite you to go ahead now. If you have not done so, go to slido.com. Don't worry, you just go into your browser and search for Slido, and the instructions are here. And all you need to do is put in, of course, the mantra of UNICEF, which is for every child. So you're going to go ahead and put that in, and you will see the discussion forum, and as well there is a question and answer / poll for you to partake in. So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, as you do that, I ask you to put your hands together for the gentleman who leads the team at CAPRI, Dr. Damian King. And again, CAPRI is the leading think tank in the region, and of course known for their stellar work in policy research. Put your hands together for him, please.
Thank you, Javon. Good evening, everyone. One of the whiz-bang technologies that natural science has come up with recently is gene editing. That is how you get the offspring to be different from the parents. That is how you get the offspring to be able to shed diseases that might be inherent and predilections that might be inherent in the parents' genes. We would like to do the same thing for society, for social reproduction, for the next generation. And that's what policy change seeks to do. It seeks to edit the societal DNA so the next generation does not carry on some of the ills and some of the problems of the existing generation. It's editing at the societal level. I'm Damian King, the Executive Director of the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, and it gives me particular pleasure to be at the launch of this report. CAPRI, for those of you who are not aware, is an independent think tank devoted to evidence-based research towards improving public policy making in Jamaica and the Caribbean. This event is a collaboration with UNICEF, in which we are turning our research spotlight on effectively, what are the ways to effectively do our societal editing of the next generation. UNICEF is the perfect partner in this exercise. The challenge of policy making in relation to children is that children don't have a vote. Any part of society that gets a vote gets public policy attention. You know, this is why children have a month. May is Child Month. Children have a month. Any segment of society that has a month, that is your signal that they don't get attention otherwise. And this is why the work of UNICEF, not only in Jamaica but worldwide, is of crucial importance. Because this important part of society that doesn't have a vote has the voice, has UNICEF as the voice of children. And when you combine that representation that UNICEF represents all around the world and CAPRI's research capacity and effectiveness at stimulating and promoting policy change, then that tells you that it's a partnership that is likely to achieve change in the Jamaican society. We are going to have, following my speaking, we're going to have remarks from UNICEF, then a presentation of key findings of the report, by Dr. Diana Thorburn, who's the lead researcher on this project and CAPRI's director of research. Then we're going to have some comments from a representative of the Ministry of Education, Skills, Youth, and some other things. Education, youth, skills, and information. You know, in the Caribbean, every responsibility of a ministry has to be in the ministry's name. So that's why the ministry's name have to change every single cycle. Dr. Stephen Carr is the Director of Policy Analysis, Director of the Policy Analysis and Research Unit, and he will be giving those remarks. Then we'll have a panel discussion on the findings of the report. On the panel will be Dr. Thorburn and also Andra Miller, who is a social policy specialist with UNICEF in Jamaica. And that panel discussion will be moderated by Javon Keys, who introduced us a short while ago. I'm now going to invite to the podium UNICEF's country representative here in Jamaica, Olga Isaza.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. The protocol has been established. Let me say that I am very glad to have the opportunity to present this report with CAPRI, one of the most serious think tanks in the region. So it is a pleasure to be with you for the launch of the Room for Improvement, the most thorough examination of child-focused public expenditure in Jamaica in 2 decades. Let me begin by thanking the government of Jamaica, the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, the Planning Institute of Jamaica, the Minister of Education, our partners, CAPRI, and all of you here this evening for engaging with a question that is absolutely critical. How can every dollar that Jamaica invests in its children work harder for them? This study starts from an important premise. Jamaica has made a sustained effort to invest in its children. Over the past 9 years, the country has protected social spending and allocates to children a share of the national budget that is comparable to many high-income countries. Education has been treated as a priority, and programs such paths have cushioned the impact of poverty on children, including during COVID. At the same time, the evidence is sobering. Children remain consistently poorer than the national average, and rural children poorest still. Despite high level of investment in education, learning outcomes have not improved at the pace we would hope, especially for boys, children with disabilities, and adolescents out of school. In areas such as mental health, child protection, nutrition, and housing, gaps in services and outcomes remain significant. Why then does it matter to measure public expenditure on children? Because what we cannot see, we cannot manage. Today, Jamaica does not yet have a system that routinely shows how much its public expenditure actually reaches children. Budget data are not disaggregated by age or beneficiary group. And in many sectors, a large share of what we describe as a child-focused spending is necessarily devoted to compensations and core operating costs, leaving limited fiscal space for other critical program inputs that service and system for children require. This is not unique to Jamaica. Many countries have discovered that their public finance management systems were never designed to make children visible in their budgets. The result is that ministries, permanent secretaries, and parliaments must take difficult decisions on the basis of partial information. When we measure child-focused expenditure more clearly, 3 things become possible. First, we can see whether public resources are aligned with the structural challenges children face: poverty, violence, mental health, geographic inequalities. Second, we can verify whether the commitments made to children are backed by realistic and traceable budgets, and whether those budgets are sustained over the time. Third, we can have a more honest conversation about trade-offs, not only whether we are spending enough, but whether we are spending in the right places, at the right time, in a child's life, and in the right way. What CAPRI and UNICEF have done together is to build from public data the most complete picture currently available of how Jamaica is investing in its children across 8 sectors. The report looked at the 9 years of budget and asked 4 very practical questions. How much is being spent on children and where? How that spending is composed? Whether government commitments to children are backed by visible and sustainable budget lines, and where data exists, whether outcomes are moving in the same direction as spending. The answer are nuanced. In education, total spending on children has risen, but operational budgets are under pressure, as most of the investment is absorbed by the weight of bill. In social protection, PAT has shown that Jamaica can deliver large-scale, predictable support to children in poverty, yet benefits levels and complementarity services do not always keep the pace with rising costs for families. In child protection and mental health, we see progress in specific programs, but systems that are still too small and fragmented to match the scale of children's needs. The central message is clear. Jamaica's challenge is not only how much it is spent on children, but how that spending is structured, tracked, and translated into outcome. One of the most important messages of this report is forward-looking. This is not yet a government-owned system for tracking child-focused expenditure. It is an independent analysis that demonstrates what is possible. In every country where this agenda has shaped policy in a lasting way, Ministry of Foreign or Finance and Planning have taken ownership of the methodology and embedded it in the budget process. That is what turns a one-off study into a routine part of public finance management. This brings me to 3 very concrete and I hope reasonable proposals. First, to explore with the Ministry of Finance and PIOJ a national approach to tagging child-focused programs within the budget classification, so that what is spent on children becomes visible without needing a special study every few years. This could begin as a pilot in a few key sectors and expand over time. Second, the progressively strengthen the publication of data on coverage, unit cost, and outcomes for major programs serving children in education, social protection, health, and protection. This does not require creating new systems from scratch, but using existing information systems to make child-relevant data more accessible and more useful for decision makers. Third, to reinforce reporting and accountability mechanisms in areas where children are particularly vulnerable. For example, ensuring regular public responding by agencies with child protection mandates and integrating child-specific indicators into annual performance framework. None of these steps require new legislation tomorrow morning or large new resources. They require something more fundamental: a shared decision to make children visible in the budget and to use this visibility to protect and strengthen the services on which they depend. The report is not a verdict on any single ministry or institution. It is a mirror that we hold up together. For government, it is a tool to sharpen policy and make the most of constrained fiscal space. For Parliament, oversight bodies, civil society, the private sector, and development partners, it's offered a common evidence-based support to Jamaica efforts for children. Children cannot vote, as was said prior, cannot lobby, and cannot allocate budgets. Their interests must therefore be reflected in the choices we make in laws, in budgets, and in the data we choose to collect and use. UNICEF values this alliance with CAPRI, not only for its analytical rigor, but also for its deep understanding of Jamaica's policy landscape and public finance system. Their ability to translate complex budget data into clear, actionable insights is precisely why UNICEF chose CAPRI for this work. Together, we can generate evidence that is both technically robust and directly usable for better decisions for children. UNICEF stands ready to continue working with the government of Jamaica and all of you to take this agenda forward. The fact that we are having this conversation in this way is already a sign of Jamaica's commitment to its youngest citizens. Our task now is to turn that commitment into systems and practices that will outlast us. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause for Olga Isasa, or UNICEF representative here in Jamaica. And let me also say congratulations on your new appointment, as in short order she'll be going to become the Deputy Regional Director for UNICEF in the Latin American Caribbean office. So congratulations to you on that appointment. Y buena suerte a usted. Let me also take the opportunity as well to say a very special welcome to the Mayor of Kingston, His Worship, Andrew Swaby. We thank you so very much for joining us, sir. And let me also say a very special welcome to our listeners on Nationwide 90 FM all across Jamaica. We're so happy that they are able to be here to hear the findings, which brings us nicely into why we're here, ladies and gentlemen. So all of this research has been done, and as you heard, Dr. Diana Thorburn, lead researcher at CAPRI, is going to be coming to give us a sense of what the findings were in this very important research, Room for Improvement, the gap between public spending and child outcomes in Jamaica. This is also my reminder to you that the Slido is up and running. So during the presentation, if you have any questions, any burning thoughts, you can use the Slido, and reminding you that it's for every child. That's your access code. So for those of you online listening on the airwaves and in the room, that is your opportunity to write down those questions, share them, and we will see how best we can go through as many of them as possible. So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Dr. Thorburn as she comes forward to give you the findings.
Over the last 3 decades, Jamaica has spent an average of 5% of its GDP on education. In 2023, that figure amounted to 19% of our total GDP. That is above Latin American and Caribbean average, and it is above OECD averages. It is consistent with expenditure in the world's richest countries, in the world's top performing education systems. We are allocating a share of our national income to education at the level of rich countries. We spend like a rich country. And yet, a child entering school today in Jamaica can expect 11 and a half years of schooling, but will learn only the equivalent of 7 of them. Jamaica's score on the World Bank's Human Capital Index, which measures the productive potential a child born today will reach by age 18, is 0.53, meaning a Jamaican child is on track to realize just over half their potential. We spend like a rich country, but we're not getting the outcomes of one. That gap between what Jamaica spends and what Jamaican children receive and the outcomes we have to show for the money spent is what this report is about. There are many reasons to spend on children, but there is one particular reason why we should not only spend on children, but why we should measure what we spend on children. And that is because the stakes are higher now than they ever have been. Everybody in this room is aware of Jamaica's fertility rate, one of the lowest in the world. Our population is aging, and the flip side of that is that our child population is shrinking. Every single child matters more now than it did before. When a country like Jamaica's child cohort shrinks, each child carries more of the weight of the country's future. They're a larger share of the workforce that is expected to drive growth, pay taxes, and sustain the generation above them. The return on investing on any single child goes up, and the cost of failing also goes up. So we have fewer children, higher stakes. I'm not here to give you a headline number. Jamaica does spend on children. It spends a lot. It spent more in 2025 than it did in 2024, and it spent more in 2024 than it did in 2023, and so on. But I can't give you a headline number, and I'm going to tell you why, because it will help to explain what the report does and what the report found. We did calculate a per-child expenditure figure, and we did calculate a total spending on children number, but there's no point in sharing it because that number would be meaningless. Why would it be meaningless? First, we cannot count it all. A large share of child-relevant expenditure never appears in the budget, in the expenditure, which is what we examined for this report. Entities such as NHT, Chase, InSports, JSIF all spend heavily on children. Those numbers do not appear in the estimates of expenditure. External financing supports a lot of child expenditure. That doesn't come in the estimates. Civil society spends a lot on children. That doesn't come in the estimates. Even allocations that do appear are often in budget lines that cannot be accurately disaggregated across all the populations that they serve, across all age groups. So any number that we come up with would be incorrect by construction and therefore inaccurate. Second, and probably more importantly, even a complete figure, even if we were able to get to a figure that we felt somewhat confident in, it still would not tell us what we need to know. Money allocated is not money delivered. The question that matters is not how much goes in, it is what comes out. And the link between the two depends on implementation, institutional capacity, accountability, and those are precisely the things that the report found to be deficient. A large number might suggest that the problem is solved. A small number might suggest that the solution is simply to spend more. Neither conclusion is warranted. What this report does instead is examine what the pattern of spending says about priorities and why the structures needed to turn spending into outcomes are not currently working. So what we did measure, we examined 9 years of the approved estimates of expenditure from 2017-18 to 2025-26 across 8 categories of child-relevant spending. These are the categories most commonly used, though with some variation in UNICEF's studies similar to this all across the globe. What matters is not the quantum, it is where the money goes, whether we're getting the outcomes we expect, and how we can do better. So put another way, the report does not assess whether Jamaica is spending enough or if it should spend more, but whether allocations are structured to translate into outcomes, a question that requires examining the conditions of delivery rather than the totals of appropriation. Here's what we found. When we talk about investing in children in Jamaica, we almost always mean education. Education dominates. It is by far the largest category of child-relevant spending in the estimates year after year. Jamaica spends more of its GDP on education, as I said earlier, than comparator countries and even more than richer countries, and yet learning outcomes remain low, human capital scores disappoint, and importantly, Jamaica, which has the lowest productivity in the Latin American Caribbean region, only Haiti and Cuba are lower than us, has a workforce whose productivity does not reflect the investment. Part of the explanation lies not just in how much is spent on education, it lies in what is being spent or not spent before children ever reach a classroom. The most consequential period of a child's life is the first 1,000 days, from birth to its 3rd birthday. This is when the brain develops the fastest, when nutrition deficits become permanent, when neglectful parenting leaves lasting dysregulation. Where a child lives and grows in these early years, the composition of the household, the geographical location, the volatility of the community, these have an outsized effect on who that child becomes. The rate of return on investing in this window is higher than at any later stage. The negative experiences of toxic stress, poor nutrition, inadequate stimulation can reduce adult earnings by up to 25%. What happens in the first 3 years leaves a mark that no subsequent investment can fully erase. Not a good primary school or a great high school, not a scholarship, not a well-resourced education system. The first 1,000 days are largely outside the education budget. They belong in health, in housing, in nutrition, in child protection, in social protection, which are precisely the categories where Jamaica's spending is the thinnest, the least protected, and the most opaque. Education spending cannot deliver its potential returns where the foundations were not built. Jamaica is investing heavily at the wrong end of the developmental timeline. This is a structural issue. There's a second structural problem running across almost every category we examined. The budget exists, the allocations are there, money is being spent, but an increasing share of every allocation across almost every sector is going to compensation of employees, salaries and wages for the people employed to deliver these services. And a correspondingly shrinking share is going to goods, services, and operational resources that actually deliver it. In education, compensation of employees absorbed roughly 83% of the budget in 2017-2018, and by 2024-2025, that had increased to 86%. The same pattern holds in child protection, food and nutrition, and recreation, culture, and sport. In 2022, the government implemented a major public sector restructuring. It was a rational response to long-standing wage compression. Teachers, social workers, public sector workers, broadly speaking, should be paid more. But it was not accompanied by a corresponding increase in operational budgets. So the wage bill went up, but to date, and maybe it's too soon to say, improved services have not followed. Money is being spent, it's not reaching the children. If we take a closer look at recreation, culture, and sport, we'll see how all of these issues that I've just been talking about come together. Recreation and culture and sport receive less child-relevant expenditure than any of the other 7 categories that we examined. Less than 2% of the total, declining in real terms across the entire review period. Compensation of employees has risen from 37% to 57% of category spending, further compressing the little operational budget that had existed. In sports and chase are 2 of the major spenders in this area, but their contribution cannot be established from public documentation because they're not traceable in the government estimates in a form that allows expenditure analysis. We also looked at the commitments in this sector, and the fulfillments of commitments were also found lacking. In 2018, the government committed to developing a national safeguarding framework for children in sport and culture. 7 years later, no publicly verifiable output has been identified. The commitment to develop CHAMPS as a premier global track event has no traceable dedicated budget line. We consider ourselves a cultural, creative, and track and field superpower, but we are not funding the conditions that produce it. There's a thread that runs through everything I have described and across all sectors. It persists because there is no mechanism to make these failures visible and no consequence for leaving them unaddressed. Across every sector that we examined, across every category we examined, we found no performance frameworks linking expenditure to outcomes and no disaggregated reporting connecting spending to what children actually received. So the estimates tell us what government intends to spend, what it plans to spend, what it spent the previous year, but it does not tell us what was delivered, to whom, or with what result. No requirement to report on outcomes means there is no onus to achieve them. The absence of data is not just a data gap, and this is a finding of the report. It is an accountability gap. The report covers a lot more ground than I have been able to do here this evening, and I would encourage you to read it for the full detail. And so we have 5 recommendations in the report, 4 of which I'm going to share here, 2 of which are not covered in the report, but I'll give a brief explanation of how those recommendations came about. And the first is kind of the obvious one, is that government introduced child disaggregated reporting requirements into our public financial management framework, requiring ministries and agencies with child-focused mandates to report child-specific program targets, output indicators, and prior year outturn, meaning what they actually spent the previous year, in their annual budget submissions, embedding this in statute over time to ensure continuity across administrations. We need to shift investment in our children towards the earlier and the earliest years of the life cycle. The budgets for early childhood health, nutrition, housing stability, child protection, and family support must be grown at a rate commensurate with the evidence on where the returns are highest. Recommendations 3 and 4 relate to child protection, though we didn't go into detail in the presentation. The child protection system has its own institutional weaknesses and allocation asymmetries, and the report flags it in particular need of stronger accountability measures. One of the recommendations in the report is related to child protection, and it is specifically related to children in state care who are overwhelmingly placed in institutional settings rather than family-based care, even though we know from overwhelming evidence that they have poorer outcomes, that it is a higher cost on the public purse, and that this is against the government's own stated commitment to deinstitutionalization. The report is recommending a structural shift by establishing a permanency planning framework for children in state care underpinned by a revised adoption statute, a domestic foster care financing model, and a case management protocol that moves away from the operational default of institutions to family-based placement, with a strategic plan to move away from institutional care completely. No more children's homes. And finally, one very specific and time-bound, time-sensitive recommendation that sits outside all the thematic clusters. I don't know how many people remember when the Prime Minister announced this wonderful Hope for Children Trust Fund in 2024. It is supposed to have its seed funding this fiscal year. The government needs to create the legislation for it and appoint a fund manager to fulfill its commitment, its very important commitment to children. What this study found, in one sentence, is that there is a gap between what we spend, what our children receive, and the country that we become as a result. It's not just children are the future, it is about the country that we are and the country that we want to become. Jamaica has solved harder problems than this. The fiscal consolidation of the past 15 years, the restructuring of public debt, the restoration of macroeconomic stability, the rebuilding of fiscal space, all of these required political will, institutional discipline, and difficult decisions across successive administration, and it worked. In having solved that problem, it has created the conditions for us for the first time in a generation to have the fiscal space to get what we do for our children right. We are not a rich country yet, but we can afford to do better by our children. We can afford to invest in our children in a way that we know where the money goes and we get commensurate returns. The question is not whether Jamaica can track what we spend on children. It's not whether we can measure what they receive. It's not whether we can treat every dollar as an investment in our country's future. The question is, are we going to choose to? Thank you.
Thorburn, put your hands together for her once again. Setting some gears churning, I'm sure, for many persons, because you recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that Jamaica is, as is usually the case in many instances, well ahead of the game. We are spending a lot on education. But the findings, and we'll discuss a little bit more in our panel discussion. But at this juncture, I'm going to give the opportunity for us to hear the ministerial response from Dr. Stephen Carr. Please make him welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Ms. Olga Izaza, representative of UNICEF Jamaica, distinguished representatives of UNICEF and CAPRI, principals and staff, colleagues from government entities and our development partners, our diaspora representatives, teachers, students, ladies and gentlemen. I bring greetings on behalf of Senator Dr. the Honorable Dana Morris Dixon, our permanent secretary, Major Dr. Kassan Troop, and the wider team of the Ministry of Education, Skills, Youth, and Information. I am very pleased. Where I sit at the ministry, we do policies. I'm pleased that we have an opportunity to create policies to address the issues that we speak of today. So I'm pleased to join you this afternoon at the launch of this particular report. First of all, let me first commend UNICEF and CAPRI for producing what is clearly a serious and thoughtful contribution to the national conversation about children, education, and development. Reports like these are important because they challenge us to look beyond simple questions such as how much money are we spending, and instead ask deeper questions. Are we spending wisely? Are programs reaching our children who need them most? Can the public clearly see where resources are going? And most importantly, are children's life actually improving because of these investments? These are fair questions. They are necessary questions, and the ministry welcomes this discussion. Now I also want to speak directly to the students in the audience. Sometimes when people hear discussions about budget and public finance, it can sound distant or complicated. But really, this conversation is about you. It's about whether schools have the resources they need. It's about whether students can access textbooks, digital devices, and safe classroom. It's about whether a child with special learning needs get proper support. It's about whether young people have opportunities to succeed regardless of their background and our community. So when we talk about public financing to children, we're speaking about investing in Jamaicans' future. The report correctly highlights that Jamaica must improve how child-focused spending is tracked, evaluated, and connected to outcomes. That's an important point, and the one that the ministry takes seriously. At the same time, we must also be balanced in how we interpret the findings. The report should not be seen as evidence that Jamaica is in textbook, digital learning resources, and teacher laptops. We have improved school infrastructure. We have reduced the number of schools operating on the shift system. And we continue to support teachers and school personnel who are essential to student services. The ministry does not claim that every challenge has been solved. We know there's much work to do. But it's important that the national conversation recognize that both the progress made and the areas that still requires improvement. One point raised in the report relates to the compensation costs in education. Yes, salaries and wages account for a large share of educational spending, But we must remember something very important. In education, people are the service. Children are not separated, or teachers are not separated from educational delivery. Teachers are educational delivery. Guidance counselors, special educators, principals, dean of discipline, classroom assistants, support staff are the people who help students learn, grow, and succeed every single day. So the conversation should not be framed as though investing in educators somehow takes resources away from children. The real challenge is finding the right balance, ensuring fair compensation for educators while also strengthening classroom resources, student support service, and operational funding. The report also highlights the importance of early childhood development and early stimulation programs, including brain builders. The ministry welcomes that attention because we know the earliest years of a child's life are crucial to long-term learning and development. Programs like brain builders are not simply ideas on paper. They form part of a wider support system involving parental support, early stimulation, early childhood intervention. Moving forward, the ministry is prepared to continue working closely with UNICEF, CAPRI, the Ministry of Health and Wellness, the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, and other partners to strengthen the continuum of support for children from birth onwards. Another important issue raised in the report is the challenge of budget visibility and tracking. And this is an area where the ministry agrees improvement is needed. Sometimes government programs are not easily visible in public budgets because funding is organized by program categories and administrative structures than by specific beneficiary group. That does not necessarily mean programs are absent or inactive, but we accept that better child-focused reporting should help improve transparency, accountability, and public understanding. And so the ministry is prepared to work in these three practical areas going forward. First, improve child-focused reporting within the education budget. Second, strengthen public's reporting on outputs and outcomes in areas such as special ed, early childhood development, school nutrition, and learning recovery. And third, collaborate with the Ministry of Finance, the Planning Institute of Jamaica, UNICEF, and other partners to strengthen the child-focused expenditure tracking across government. Ladies and gentlemen, reports such as this plays an important role in informing policy decision, strengthening partnerships, strengthening planning, supporting continuous improvement within the sector. The ministry welcomes constructive review and analysis as accountability and transparency remain essential to national development. At the same time, it's important that assessments are balanced, evidence-based, and considered within the broader national context. Jamaica has continued to make significant investment in its children, particularly through the education sector. Our task now is to ensure that these investments becomes more visible, more targeted, more measurable, and ultimately more effective in improving the outcomes for our young children. And to the students here today, I leave with you this thought. Every discussion about educational policy, every budget decision, every reform initiative, all of it ultimately about creating better opportunities for you and for the generation coming behind you. I thank you very much, and I wish you a productive and meaningful launch session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Carr, for bringing that response on behalf of the Ministry of Education, Skills, Youth, and Information. And we thank you so very much for being here, and we know that the conversation will continue beyond today. That's the whole idea of these kinds of discussions and this kind of research, ladies and gentlemen, because the change will not take place in this room, but it's what we'll do beyond here. And when we'll look at the recommendations and conversations about how we can make the changes recommended, or looking at how each representative and in their own spaces can make changes, then that's how we're going to make a difference. So we are going to be having our panel discussion. And a reminder to you, ladies and gentlemen, that wherever you are, you can send us questions via our Slido. That's SLIDO. So go ahead, and once you get there, the code is for every child. So once you enter that, you'll be able to access and send your questions. And already we're seeing a few questions coming in. So we look forward to getting those questions answered by our panelists. And of course, Dr. Thorburn will be back on stage to take a few of those questions. And she'll be joined by Mr. Andre Miller from UNICEF. And of course, once again, the UNICEF team, very integral in ensuring that this report was done, and they commissioned CAPRI because of how important this discussion and this report overall is for ensuring that we leave no one behind. And of course, that's a tagline linked to our Global Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, leaving no one behind. And we can look at quality education and ensuring that we leave no one behind by ensuring that all the finances trickle down in the right ways. And we're going to be having a bit more of a discussion on that. So of course, ladies and gentlemen, I see a couple more questions coming in. And of course, keep the conversation going online as well. There are a number of people who are not in this room, but they need to see and hear about what's taking place here today. So go ahead and ensure that you tag CAPRI online, and of course UNICEF online as well at various social media platforms to ensure that we have the conversation going beyond this evening. So I'm going to ask my panelists to join me, and I'm asking you to put your hands together for them as well. For clarity. All right, so one of the very important things, or one of the first questions I wanted to ventilate, because I got asked, what's this gap that's being referred to in the title of this report? So Dr. Thorburn, perhaps I'll start with you. I mean, the gap between public spending and child outcomes in Jamaica, what would you say is that gap that we're looking at?
So it's what we're putting in and what we're getting out, and we're not getting out commensurate with what we're putting in. And this is why this whole idea of not having a headline number is such a key aspect of thinking about the findings of the report. It doesn't matter if we're putting in $10 or $100. If we're not getting $10 worth of an outcome or $100 worth of an outcome, then it doesn't matter how much it is. So it is trying to understand what is happening between the input of the money and the output of the human worker, citizen, member of the labor force, not even the child, the person who is going to be the part of Jamaica that's going to keep Jamaica going forward. That's where that gap is.
And of course, the conversation beyond now will tell us that it's not a concern about spending or allocation of resources, in the sense that from a headline budgetary standpoint, Jamaica is in fact spending a lot on education, but it's a number of intricate things. For instance, how do we outline in the budget where this money is going? How can we track that from a transparency and governance standpoint? But let me bring you in, Andre. I mean, why is it important for us to do studies like this? I mean, of course, we know that UNICEF is big on ensuring that our children are, catered for, and when we look at the Convention of the Rights of the Child, but why do we need to be looking at this kind of data, this kind of research?
Yeah, thank you. I think we're at a very seminal moment for Jamaica as a country. We are just a few years yet from our reflection on the 2030 Development Plan, as well as the SDGs.
Right, all right, sustainable development
and
goals.
that's important for us to note, because a budget signals a country's priority. And for children, they often do not have the opportunity to lobby on their own behalf. And so they need adults to speak up for them, to advocate for them, to put before the decision makers critical realities that they face. And so this moment, this study gives us an opportunity to pause. And what is beautiful about it is that it confirms that yes, Jamaica has spent and is spending billions on children, but it's now time to turn the corner and to begin to look at how do we now monitor what's really happening, and how do we ensure that all our children are receiving the critical support that we are providing for them? How do we ensure that coverage reaches all children? And as is the tagline for UNICEF, we are here for every child. We leave no child behind. As it is right now, if we don't monitor, there is the likelihood that we're leaving some children behind. And so this study causes us to pause, to reflect, and to put in place some very low-cost and low-hanging actions that can cause us to really bring more children into the safety net.
I will reinforce some of those low-hanging actionable items a little later on in the discussion. But one of the things, anytime I speak to researchers, I always like to ask, because there's always that idea that you may go into that research with a thought or an expectation of what the possible outcomes could be. So I'm going to come to you, Dr. Thorburn, with that question shortly, but I wanted to ask you, were you surprised by anything in particular, Andre, when you saw the findings of this research?
The evidence shows commitment. It also shows that this commitment is repeated year after year after year.
So there's no doubt that we are keen on investing in our children.
Exactly. However, the allocations and expenditures are not always visible. And so that's where we have to now take the conversation. We know that we're a child-friendly nation. We now have to look at how do we tangibly demonstrate that we're a child-friendly nation, and that is in our budget.
But for somebody who may be listening or watching and maybe wondering, but why does it need to be visible? If it is that the money is there and it's being allocated, why does it need to be visible?
As was said earlier in the presentation, if it's not seen, it's not done. And that's the truth. And because children, and I made the comment, because children don't vote, they are often not deemed a constituent of the broader constituency. And so their voices gets lost in the thick of the noise in the marketplace. But the truth is, they are the investment for the future. The country has to begin to look at the capital outlay now, or the significant capital outlay later. And I put it to the country that if UNICEF says if you make that investment today, you're likely to spend less tomorrow.
Absolutely, because one of the there are a couple of things that stood out for me in processing this research, but the first 1,000 days, the most consequential in any child's life. And those first 1,000 days, if the right investment isn't made, as an adult, that child is likely to see about a 25% drop in their potential economic earning.
Yeah, so the evidence for that is actually phenomenal, and it was done right here in Jamaica, and we detailed this in the report itself. But there's been a remarkable longitudinal study of Jamaican children. I think that cohort is about 35 now, and they were able to show very clearly in very rigorous research with extremely high integrity that the children who received stimulation, and the stimulation was they trained the mothers of these babies to play with their babies. They trained the mothers to look their babies in the eye and talk to them. That was the stimulation. Those children grew up to have fewer criminal issues. They stayed longer in school. They had better employment outcomes. They had better health, physical as well. There was a nutritional component to the intervention. They earned 25% more than the control group, which did not receive the intervention, meaning their mothers did not get trained to play with them as babies. So yes, the data is very clear that those first 1,000 days have a tangible output that we can actually count, and that was done right here in Jamaica. So it's not even something we can say, oh, that's an imported thing that happens elsewhere. And that research has been taken from here and put into policy and programs all around the world.
Jamaica leading as always, but very interesting findings there. But let me bring it back to my original question about what did you expect to find, and did it match up with what you actually found in your research?
Yeah, so CAPRI's been doing research on children since 2018. We first started with the UNICEF Situation Analysis of Children in Jamaica report. It was the first research we had ever done, and You know, many people think of CAPRI as an organization that does research on children, but it started there. Every single report we have done since then came out of that original situation analysis. And then I wear other hats as well in child protection outside of CAPRI. So I was pretty certain that the research was just going to support my preconceived notion that we don't spend enough. And so I was happily, you know, it's always nice as a researcher to find something you didn't expect. And I actually was surprised by the finding we spend more than I realized. I wasn't surprised that we're not accounting for it, but what it said to me was that we have the money, we're spending the money, we're not short of money to spend on children. As I said, we're not a rich country yet, but we have more resources than we have ever had, and we have a stated commitment to children. And it's not, you know, we talk about children are the future, they don't have votes and so on, but we're also really we're talking about the country that we are all a part of. It's not just that children are cute and they're vulnerable. I mean, this is nation building. So there's a developmental question as well, a development question, not just about children. We're talking about the country that we're building and that we're creating.
So, I mean, there are a number of recommendations, 5 particularly, and we're going to get to them shortly. But for you, Andre, I mean, UNICEF has always been keen on ensuring that you have a real sense of, one, what's happening with our children, and of course, finding solutions to ensuring that we leave none of our children behind. So from this report, there are a number of potential low-hanging fruits, but what would you say in your view, would be maybe a top 1 or 2 that could potentially be accelerated so we could see potentially some movements towards those recommendations being realized?
Yeah. So we need to get to the stage, as is the case in other countries, Guatemala, Argentina. We need to know where the money is going. Yeah? We need to follow where the money is going so that we can know whether or not our coverage is increasing. We also need to know the adequacy of that spend. So one of the things that UNICEF is recommending out of this analysis is that we begin a process of tagging the budget. And what is really tagging the budget? Is putting in place a code that looks at critical deprivations that children experience. So say, for example, you want to know how many children have been vaccinated. Not only would you want to know how many have been vaccinated, but you want to know where those children are located, how many in rural Jamaica. You want to know how many boys, how many girls. You want to know how many children with disabilities. So disaggregating the data by some critical domains that allows us to know to what extent we are reaching the children where they are, so that when the next fiscal cycle comes, because Jamaica has an excellent fiscal responsibility framework, we now have to move that framework to the point of not just establishing procedures, but we need to move the framework to the point of being able to monitor how effective we are at executing that framework. So tagging the budget allows us to be able to know who the money is reaching, and also whether the resources are adequate, and if we need to increase or adjust as the case may be, as we would have found in the public expenditure review we conducted with the World Bank some years ago. It pretty much said Jamaica is spending well on education, 5% of GDP, that's great. When you compare that in the region, we're doing well. When you compare it to OECD countries, we're doing well. However, we need to look a little bit more at the data. The data is saying to us that we're not spending as much on early childhood education, where there is a higher return on investment for the country in comparison to other levels of education. Not saying we should stop, but we need to look at where it matters most and where do we get value for money, stronger value for money.
Absolutely. Now, Dr. Thorburn, one of our audience members they've sent in a question, and they're asking, anything to what you're saying now, are there any examples where targeted spending has produced meaningful improvements for children?
Mm-hmm. The one that comes most to mind, so in the report, you know, we looked at, I think it was 40 different commitments that we could trace, that the commitment was made, and we could identify a budget line for, or some line of expenditure for, and the extent to which it was completed. And there were 4 fully aligned commitments that were made. And one of them was the Ramps in Schools program, where the Ministry of Education had committed to making schools more accessible to special needs children. And they had set a target of how many ramps in how many schools, and they met that target. It was allocated for and it was delivered. And what was characteristic of all of the commitments that were aligned, so all the commitments that were fulfilled, was that they had dedicated numerical targets, dedicated budget lines, and accountability frameworks. That was the common thing. Even though these 4 commitments were all different across different times and across different sectors, that was the common feature of the 4 fulfilled or aligned commitments. So that would be one of them. There weren't, as I said, it was 4 out of, I think, 40, if I remember correctly. So most of them are only partially aligned, a few are unaligned. There was one category that almost was what we called reversed, where government had gone back on its spending, which is in the allocation for foster care, children who are in foster care. When we looked at real allocations over the period, over the review period, the real allocation to foster care has gone down quite dramatically between 2017, 2018, 2024, 2025, 2026. And that is extremely troubling for so many reasons. One is there's a stated commitment to deinstitutionalization, meaning to placing children more in family environments than in children's homes. Yet the amount that is being spent is going down. We also know that the cost of a child in a family, in a foster care placement, is about 10% of the cost of a child in a children's home. So it is mind-boggling that more children are not being placed in family placements, that we're continuing to put children in children's homes at such a high cost with such poor conditions in the homes. So that is kind of the reverse example of where targeted spending achieved. This is something that we have identified is spending is decreasing, the real spending is decreasing, and this is on a stated commitment. So there's so many concerns about that particular line, and that's actually a line in the budget. That is actually a line in the budget of how much is allocated to foster care. So we were able to trace that just through looking in the estimates, and you can see the decrease in the real spend on children in foster care.
Andre, when we look at the fact that Jamaica is at a place where we're below replacement rate, roughly, and the conversations now, and you said it in your findings, Dr. Thorburn, that every dollar spent now is even more critical because we have fewer children, which means that the investment in each child is absolutely important for us to see a return on that investment. So I wanted to ask you, Andre, I mean, when you look at that reality, how critical is it for us to move now to make these changes? And it's not necessarily changes per se, because as also shared in the report, a number of them are low-hanging fruits. But how would we, based on what you're seeing, UNICEF has seen across the region, and based on this report, how much of a threat would you say is inaction based on the findings of this report?
Which is where I'll start. The cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of action. Jamaica already has the framework to be able to institute a lot of these recommendations, and there are not many recommendations. It's 5. Very low-hanging fruits. Within this fiscal year, the budget call comes in September. We can sit together. The Ministry of Finance is at the table. We have had conversations with the Ministry of Education present, Labor and Social Security, and so we believe that the first starting point is let's look at the indicators. Let's look at the indicators that are aligned to children's development and well-being. And let us see how we can begin to code those in the budget so that by the end of the next fiscal year, we can make some more concrete statements about the expenditure. That's 1. 2, I do believe that Jamaica has significant goodwill, and when we look at the lay of the land within the region, UNICEF has been a partner of choice for the government of Jamaica when it comes down to children's well-being, and that's not my gospel. It was said by Dr. King earlier, and as such, we stand toe-to-toe ready to support the government with technical assistance within the region. We're a multi-country office come next year, which means that we're bringing far greater technical boots on the ground to support not just Jamaica, but the region to move on this in a collective manner. It's a homogeneous conversation, a homogeneous topic that affects not just Jamaica. And so Jamaica can lead, because what is good about this, Javon, is that Jamaica has led in so many areas in development of children. We're seeing it in terms of the expenditure for PATH, direct cash transfers. It's a proven area where funds go directly to children. We're seeing it in relation to the school feeding program, where funds directly hit children, or not hit children, where funds directly impact children, yes, hit their accounts. We're also seeing it in the use of universal access policy for health, where children go to the hospitals, at no cost to them and their families. And so if we look at how we can collaborate, if we look at our indicators, if we look at coding in the budget, it becomes, these are critical key entry points that allows us to move the needle and on this issue over the next 12 months, dare I say.
So I'm sure when people read the report, they'll not have this question, but it was very clear to me that a lot of the actions required, Dr. Thorburn, don't necessarily require much expenditure at all to get done. So how would you respond to that? Because someone might be watching, lad, it's going to cost a whole heap of money if you put in them something you have a way to talk about.
So yes and no. Many of the changes, Andre mentioned that we already have several frameworks in public expenditure that can be extended to cover child-related expenditure. But I think at the core of the lack of data, the lack of tracking, the accountability weaknesses are capacity issues, institutional capacity issues. That is something that exists across the board in all sectors.
Could you delve a little bit more in
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that, and this is reflected in some ways in the compensation ratios, that we are spending a great deal on the delivery of the services. Dr. Reed said, teachers are the service. They are. But there's also a lot that needs to be done, what you might say, in the back office, that is not the teachers, that impacts what the delivery of the education service, the quality of the delivery of the education service. So, for example, mental health. We need more guidance counselors. We need more child guidance clinics. Why don't we have those? In some of the answer to that question is we don't have enough mental health professionals literally in Jamaica. So we have a capacity deficit to deliver some of these kind of side or not peripheral, but adjacent services to children that would make the investment in education. So we talked about, the investment in education. Yes, we are spending a great deal, but if that investment is not reaching a child who is prepared to receive all of that investment, if they have not had that first 1,000 days, or even if they are already in school and they're coming to school from a home where it is not meeting their developmental needs, the capacity to deliver the services and to provide for the infrastructural and program needs, that is where we do have a deficit, and that will take money to solve it. But that's where tracking comes in, because if we have a better sense of where those areas are lacking, then we can allocate for them. Now we just have a sense of it. We just have a sense that we don't have enough people working in mental health. We don't have enough social workers. Jamaica has 1/3 of the cohort of social workers that it ought to have. We ought to have 3,000 plus social workers, we have just over 1,000 social workers. That's not an obvious thing that jumps out, or is not going to jump out when you're talking about allocations. But if you're talking about capacity to deliver social services, whether to children or to any other vulnerable population, that's when you come to the capacity deficit. And that will take allocations and money to solve. But it's money that we have to spend. I mean, it's not a question, it's not a luxury, it's not welfare. These are, you know, the building blocks of our country that we're talking about. And again, it's not just about, you know, children are vulnerable. It's that this is quite literally our future. This is our tomorrow. This is our pension.
Quite literally.
Yes.
Because of course, if we're below replacement rate and we're not investing in our
Yeah.
children, it means that therefore there may be a gap as it relates to when I get to the point of retirement, there's nobody contributing to that retirement pool, for instance. But it's a serious conversation that we have to have because it's all cross-cutting, and the report shows us that it's multi-sectoral as well, which is why the report highlights 8 key sectors within which we must also take a look at how spending is linked to education and how those funds are flowing.
Javon, I just wanted to say one more thing, which is that, you know, we only looked at the estimates and at the budget. And, you know, as I had said in the outset, we can't come up with a per child number because so much spending happens outside of what we
What's
see
in
in
the
the
budget.
budget. And, you know, part of the research was to engage with the JSIF and the CHASE and the NHT. And they are all spending on children, but they are also not disaggregating and not tracking. And when you ask, it's like, yes, this is something we should be doing. We would like to do this. And so it's not just about putting in the performance expenditure management frameworks. It's also about requiring across government, all MDAs, including the ones that we don't see in the estimates, to also do child-reported spending. So if we look at NHT, and not only NHT, the HAJ as well, the Housing Agency of Jamaica, which is mandated to formalize communities and work in rural areas to improve the condition
Housing
of communities. That is a crucial area for child development. The quality and conditions of a child's home environment are incredibly important for their development and also for their performance and their ability to learn. So the same thing that we talked about, the expenditure in education, it can't be realized because many of the children aren't able to learn to fulfill their potential and take up all that expenditure and all of that investment. If we could put a dedicated line in or mandate in HAJ, in NHT, beyond just putting in a playground in a community where they're, but how is what this housing project or this community infrastructure project, how are we going to track children's outcomes in this project already? That is something that we can do and that we should do. And when we're talking, and that will also allow us to see if we're going to be shifting, if we're going to take up the recommendation of shifting more resources into the other areas outside of education that matter for education's investment to be realized and for child development more broadly. Those kinds of changes will help us to get to that, to achieve that objective.
Because it's all connected.
Yes.
Andre, one of our audience members are asking, or saying rather, there is a difference between spending in education and investing in children. And they're saying, how can the research, this research, help to redirect how we operate to see more results?
An investment is long-term. And it also looks at outcomes that you want to realize. So you put some money down because you have a plan in mind. Spending is a response to something that's happening now. We advocate for strong investments in children because children require long-term prioritization, not just only in the budget, but in all spheres of their development. And so, which is why this report not only speaks to the investments in education, but it covers 7 other sectors which are important. In fact, it's interesting that the thinnest level of expenditure goes toward the first 1,000 days That is a wonderful point for us to have the conversation, because again, as I said it before, when we make that investment at that point, we will see the returns later on. So it's not just a response to an immediate need. A baby crying, taking that child up is not just the only thing that you do. You have to begin to assess, is there hunger happening? Is the child cranky? Does the child want to sleep? So as a society, we have to take up our children in hand and not just respond to what we see at surface level, but begin to look deep within to see what are those intrinsic and internal needs that exist that we must begin to address. And that's an investment.
This is a whole of society scenario, and we're speaking a lot about a lot of the intricacies that will require government action, yes. But is there a space for consideration for private sector and other stakeholders who are also in this cross-cutting realm? What would you say, based on what you're seeing in the research, the role would be for other stakeholders in helping us to bridge that gap that now exists?
For me, the big takeaway from this report and from this research is that education is important, but there are other things that are also very important that we're not spending enough on. And a lot of pressure comes on government to spend on education. It's a very protected sector. We spend a lot on it, and a lot of pressure is put on the ministry. And there's a lot of disappointment that we are still not getting outcomes. We're putting in so much money, we're putting in so much investment, so much effort, and we're still not getting the outcomes. Our productivity levels are still extremely low. We're not seeing the human capital development that we would expect to see. And this is we have been putting money into education for a long time. So for me, the implication for private sector and also for interested Jamaicans who want to know where they need to start lobbying and start putting pressure on decision makers is we need to start putting more money into the areas, the sectors, the programs, the interventions that come before children go to school, and not just early childhood education, into the things that are, the Brain Builder program, but Brain Builder program that is going to start from early. So taking the examples and the lessons from the same Reach Up Jamaica intervention, it's not just parenting workshops, it's targeted interventions to teach mothers, not just the ones who are going to show up at the parenting workshop. Those ones you don't even need to worry about. It's always something that amuses me about our insistence on parenting training. The ones who come to the training, they're by definition already going to be okay. But that program was a home visit program. It went to visit people in their homes. You didn't have to opt in to show up. But we need to be thinking more about how we are reaching the very youngest ones who have the greatest needs. And many of those needs, we already know them. We do have data indicating where the needs are. What we don't have the data is showing how we are actually targeting those needs by putting spending where we would like it to go. And that is where the accountability frameworks and the measurement frameworks come in, in the system design of these interventions. So for me, the biggest takeaway for the private sector is, yes, education is important, but these are the areas that you, whether in your corporate social responsibility, your philanthropy, also need to be investing in the areas that are not as obvious, because it's very easy to build a computer lab or, contribute to a new roof on a school, and these are important things. But there's other areas where their spending is needed, both by government and by private sector.
Andre, did you want to add anything to that?
Every dollar has a story behind it. Whether it's having to find money for a taxi fare, or to buy a meal, or to go to the supermarket. And it's important, when I sit at my desk, I think about how does this number contribute to somebody else's life. And I say to myself, dear 5-year-old Andre, what did you need that I can provide today that would have made your life better then? And it behoves all of us sitting in this room and online to ask ourselves the question, are you a policymaker? Does your number transform somebody else's life? that $1 that we allocate toward school feeding program, toward PATH, toward the school bus program, whatever it is, mental health, it goes a mighty long way. And so we need to begin to track, where does that $1 go? Like a leaf that goes down a gully filled with water, we need to track where that $1 goes to see and ensure that it reaches every single child.
I mean, we could spend the entire evening just having this discussion based on all of the findings from the report. And I do know that there may be a few questions in the audience. While we have a few of them on Slido, however, I'm going to take those, and in the event that there are potentially any questions in the audience, we may be able to take one, but we're encouraging you to use the Slido. I see here another question: what factors have influenced or may influence a government's willingness to improve accountability and implement meaningful policies and programs? I'm going to put that one to you, Dr. Thorburn. Based on your own research over the years and even putting together this body of work, what do you see as factors that have influenced or may influence a government's willingness to improve accountability and implement these meaningful policies/programs?
So when we talk about, government's willingness, we have to think about there's the politicians, the elected officials who want to get reelected. Then there's also the bureaucracy. There are two very different layers of government. And so I think we need to think about, well, who are we trying to reach? Who are we trying to convince? Politicians, I would say, and this is based on research not only on this, but on so many of the other things that we've done over the years, they're convinced when you can present something to them that is not too difficult to do and will have a visible, tangible outturn. So this is something that they can campaign on. And it needs to not be too difficult to do because they need to be able to do it in that electoral cycle. And I would say this qualifies. This is something that I think is an easy sell. I don't think it's as easy a sell as to the people who would then have to be doing it. Holding people accountable, putting in accountability frameworks is more work for people. It is. Jamaica is a low productivity country, and we're low productivity across the board in our private sector and in our public sector. That's been a topic of the public discourse recently, is the productivity of the public sector. Putting in accountability measures in private sector or public sector is going to force people to produce results.
Which is critical.
Yes. So for me, that would be the nut that needs to be cracked.
All right, so I think I have about 10 seconds, but Andre, your closing words here.
I'll use what a youth advocate said to me. We want to see the numbers match the words. I'll end right there.
Any other short phrase you want to leave, Dr. Thorburn?
It's up to us as citizens to hold our government and our civil servants accountable.
Well, with that said, ladies and gentlemen, it has been a very insightful evening of discussion. And remember, of course, to ensure that you check out the CAPRI social media platform as well as the CAPRI website where you'll be able to find the report. Also ensure that you're following UNICEF online and you're engaging with UNICEF. Of course, they're the ones who commissioned CAPRI to get this report done. So, room for improvement. The gap between public spending and child outcomes in Jamaica. We thank you so very much for being with us here this evening, ladies and gentlemen. For those online, we thank you as well. And of course, keep the conversation going wherever you are. Until next time, my name is Javon Keys. It's been a distinct pleasure being with you this evening. And of course, please ensure that you are taking your own steps in your own spaces to keep the conversation running on this important. Thank you so very much.